Hello, everyone, and welcome to All Shall Be Well. I'm your host, Megan Rohr, and this week I wanted to chat a little bit about a trip I took to Italy. I went to Assisi, which is the home of St. Francis and Clare. St. Francis not only being the patron saint of the city where I live, but being sort of a folk hero of the pre-Middle Ages, a time when uh, monastic folk were revered because they took on extraordinary lives. And it fascinated faithful folk in a way that was above and beyond uh, churches, above and beyond theology. Remember, this is a time when most of the people in the world were illiterate and could not have their own access to the sacred texts that might be most important in their lives. Faith leaders even might only read from that text in Latin, and people would only have connections to stories about God through artwork in the sacred buildings around them. For someone like St. Francis to come forward and have a personal interaction with a being that was larger than himself gave freedom and access and hope to people who never felt like they could experience that without someone with fancy robes or fancy books or fancy education telling them how to think and how to feel and how to be in the world. And St. Francis first kind of doesn't really care about inspiring the masses because he's just preaching to the birds and wants to fix up buildings and is doing fun to draw things like casting off the clothes that his father, who was a tailor, had made for him. And St. Francis very deeply is interested in a new way of being in the world, a way of freedom from money and detachment from kind of this economic system that meant that he was supposed to do the job that his dad did and be a part of capitalistic society. So when he casts off his clothes and casts off his responsibilities, casts off the hierarchy, he becomes someone who is liberative to other people, seeking wellness through non-attachment, as the Buddhists would say, by creating this ability to share with other people, to give to others in need whenever they needed it, and taking that to such an extreme that folk with mortgages and kids can't always live in that same extreme. But Francis inspires folk well beyond his village, and people start to flock to the area to try to learn more and to hear the stories and to be a part of the greatness. And he was so beloved and so known to be miraculous that he was declared a saint just a few years after his death. And did the people following him keep holding on to his ideas that you don't have to hold on to things, that you don't have to be connected to money? They absolutely did not. Over the top of his humble brick dwellings, they built giant, beautiful cathedrals all over the space. Everywhere where Francis had a meaningful story, they put a giant basilica with an even more giant gift shop where you can buy stuff. And in fact, on my travels, the gift shops about St. Francis were 3 to 4 times more expensive than the other gift shops of everywhere else I visited on my last vacation. There are people in this world that inspire us. There are people in this world who find freedom and connection, some of that physical connection and sacred connection. And when we try to replicate it, sometimes it goes wrong. That doesn't mean St. Francis was terrible. That doesn't mean the town of Assisi is terrible. It doesn't mean that liberation isn't possible and connection to spirituality isn't possible. It just means that sometimes the way that is yours to find your way forward isn't always the way of the person following you on the trail. All Shall Be Well is a podcast that inspires you to seek the kind of self care that helps you connect with what is the healthiest that you can, what is the most faithful you can connect with, whatever that combinations of things is. And we seek to bring you diverse and different people each week to share some of what has been their path and what works for them. And today is no exception. We have a special guest with us who's going to tell us a little bit about their life. And parts of their life will be super relatable. Other parts of their life, you might think, I could never do that. The whole point is for you to imagine yourself as a part of the sacredness of this motley connection of people. Will you want to replicate everything? Who knows? Even if you try, maybe it will go just as wrong as it did in a CC. Special guest, will you introduce yourself, please?
Of course, I'm JJ Dollarhide-Godwin, and I'm really grateful to be here. I am a chaplain and work in spiritual spaces, particularly here in San Francisco. I'm focused on the transgender district at this time, and I work with the San Francisco Night Ministry as a chaplain. And I'm also a peer supporter. I provide support online through groups and through coaching, and providing both presence and accompaniment, which is the way of the faith tradition that I'm part of as a deacon. So that is who I am and what I do.
Thank you for sharing that. Are there intersections that you embody or that you hold in your way of being in the world that you'd be willing to share with us?
Yeah, I am both a queer and trans person. I use they and he pronouns both. I am also neurodiverse, and sometimes people have called that neurospicy. I also have lived within the mental health sphere and live with those disabilities in mental health and focus a lot on self care and spiritual practices as a means to support myself through both mental and physical challenges. Yeah.
And what are some of the ways with all of that that you seek to care for yourself?
That's a great question. I enjoy not only using some basic care practices like getting good sleep and eating. I enjoy exercising, actually pretty competitive in caring for myself with exercise. I love getting out and walking. Until recently, I've been doing a lot of kayaking, spending time with friends, and also just really focusing on opportunities to meet in community. So whether that be a trans meditation or a peer support group focused maybe on eating disorders or just queer spaces in general. I, in a recent trip, was able to do karaoke in a queer community, which was fantastic. And I love to celebrate the lives of others. Often I'm talking with friends about their success stories or even just their challenges and struggles, and I'm often telling them and embracing them in a way of saying, thank you for letting me celebrate that with you, because too often we don't, share our intimate details of our lives together. We're kind of just looking at the facade of who we are. And I really like sitting deeply with people. And that's often what I do in both kind of that chaplain, peer support, coaching space that I'm in.
For those who are not familiar with it, would you explain a little bit about what peer support is?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I fell into peer support about 7, 8 years ago, particularly because I was struggling with my own mental health, and it's essentially a kind of accompaniment. But peer support uses this reflective listening model to encourage people to discern their own way of being. without judgment, using trauma-informed care, often oriented towards hope, um, looking at the possibilities of what's in the world and using curiosity. Often with depression or anxiety, it's difficult to be curious and to have wonder and um, to reflect deeply on anything particular because everything feels so hopeless and heavy. And so, encouraging people to consider what options they might have, even if it's just to take a breath in this moment. I have air in my lungs right here, right now. And so, supporting folks in that space. For many years, I also um, taught suicide prevention and awareness and recovery courses. And as part of that, did a lot of accompaniment through communities who dealt with the aftermath of someone dying within their community, particularly by suicide, and supporting them through that journey of grief and awareness for themselves as well. And even in those spaces, self care is so profoundly important to continue to be available for yourself and for your own needs, and to make sure those needs are met, and also to be available to the community as well as much as possible. And sometimes that requires someone outside the community to step in and provide chaplaincy and support, or even a peer model in some sort of way.
What kinds of like peer spaces is this something that you would provide? Is it mostly in faith communities? Is right? What does that look like?
Yeah, historically, it's been a little all over the board. My favorite, I think, is within spiritual communities. Interestingly enough, when I was doing my CPE, that's clinical pastoral education, and I was doing an internship at a mental health facility as a chaplain, we rarely talked about spirituality as a peer program. And this was in Texas. Mostly at that point, we were talking about just basic mental health and just finding support every day of getting needs met or feeling creative in some particular way. Another place that I worked was in a mental health clinic system that also had a drop-in care center for unhoused folks. And as part of that, most people, and again, this is in Texas, would be quite often talking about where faith was for them, whether there was religious abuse or just a confusion about what it means to be religious, or um, how faith traditions were different for ourselves versus our family. Um, and particularly in the LGBT community in Texas, quite often there was a lot of split and separation because of religion. So while I was doing my Master's of Divinity, I was also a peer supporter full time, and it was really interesting to see all the places where people would show up needing peer support. And my favorite actually has been using a program called Hey Peers. The Depression Bipolar Support Alliance uses the Hey Peers platform online as their model for having peer support. Several other organizations does as well as one that focuses particularly on moral injury with Volunteers of America. But these groups, they meet online. It feels similar to kind of a 12-step concept if people are familiar with meeting in that way. They're organized formats where, people kind of lead with a particular topic, and then people can break out and talk to their particular needs for a few minutes. And then that's usually used with reflective listening to kind of encapsulate what somebody might have been saying, maybe what they need, provide support, ask the community of peers to provide support. So this is facilitated group peer support. So lots of ways that peers can show up in the world, as well as that one-on-one care, which I often provided online, or um, you know, to people that were in the drop-in center. It's a similar style of what I provide in chaplaincy today to the unhoused in the Tenderloin or in the transgender district. It's really noticing where people are creating community and inviting them into that conversation, because I think whether it's social media or COVID or the way that we've kind of been in the world, we're often too disconnected to really be able to have great conversations, or the conversations we're having are just, like, how's the weather? How's the day? Which are great. But if we're really, needing to feel a particular way or want to be supported in those feelings, sometimes it helps to have somebody who can notice where those emotions are moving and invite people to talk or kind of share ideas and reflects back and forth as needed.
For those who might not be familiar, will you explain what the night ministry is? You've talked a little bit about kind of caring for trans folk. What does that look like?
Yeah, the San Francisco Night Ministry, I think, has been around for about 60 years, and they have walked the streets in San Francisco, particularly focused on the unhoused in the Tenderloin and caring for folks at night, whether they need a place to stay, if they need resources or those type of information. That's been part of the work, but also just being there for a special uh, witnessing with a spiritual presence, um, listening and providing assurance that you know all is well essentially in the world, and that they are human and that they can be cared for. Um, my focus has been to take that over to the transgender district, which is one portion of the Tenderloin. And as part of the walking that I do as a transgender person, I'm specifically looking and interested in folks that are trans or queer in some particular way. And it's really fascinating how just my presence of being and walking in the neighborhood, how many trans folks will show up into my world and we'll have pretty amazing conversations about their journey and where they've been. Sometimes that feels really lucid, sometimes it doesn't. It's not for me to decide what the story is or where that's supposed to be, but really just provide accompaniment and presence and to recognize someone by name and to be able to see them time and time again when I'm essentially walking through their home as they're housed on the street. The San Francisco Night Ministry also provides a care line, which is an overnight phone line that people can call into if they're lonely or they need support. They have a lot of other different types of ministry opportunities, interfaith, whether that be they've just recently had a Sangha. They do open Shabbat and open community services, um, and as well as a Tuesday night kind of support group, sort of like a peer support model of just a check-in and sometimes a topic of conversation. So just ways of being in the world, both physically in person as well as virtually, that allow people to feel like they can be part of a larger community. And just a plug, they're always looking for volunteers to help with the call center. So if you can, check out San Francisco Night Ministry.
Well, you also mentioned that part of your self care is joy centered. It like you mentioned doing karaoke. What was that like?
Yeah, so I went on a trip and was ended up finding myself in Portugal and in Lisbon. Was able to track down an LGBT center and not speaking the language whatsoever. And luckily, the folks in Lisbon also speak English fairly well, and I was able to get myself on the list to do karaoke, and I sang True Colors, which not many people recognized, which was fine. But I did have a couple of folks that sang with me, which was great. And I think what's interesting as a trans person is my voice is shifting and changing. I also sing with a choir with Glide, and I started off as a soprano with them, and I'm kind of working through the alto, and it's confusing as I'm such a trained soprano. I struggle with different lines and um, trying to figure out where my voice is placing. And I was actually just telling my mom that I used to have a pretty smooth range, and now I'm finding that crack somewhere in between. And that definitely came out as I sang karaoke, which for me, I find joy in because it really acknowledges the transition that I'm going through. I don't lament about it at all. I actually find it pretty funny and fascinating to not feel like I have to be a perfect version of something that I never really was. And so I really enjoy the ability to celebrate the shifts of my voice and change as it's happening. So that was a really wonderful experience, and I was really grateful to be able to do that.
Are there Are there other moments of sort of ridiculous joy that have taught you something on your wellness journey, like sort of the stuck giggling of a sleepover party, or any spaces where it sort of has snuck up on you?
Yeah, I think there's definitely delight in hanging out with children. There's always fun times of doing that. I think for me, I find curiosity and delight and wonder in nature, particularly. I can spend hours looking at the sky as the clouds go by, kind of thing. And I like that I have moments where I'll notice something shimmer or be curious in the world and I'll stop, right, and take that time. I used to blow right by all of this, and it took a lot of practice of intentionality for me to be curious in the world and to find awe and wonder. When depression and PTSD or complex PTSD is mapped in the brain, it is very easy to ignore the world. It is very easy to get very focused and siloed. And for me, I become a very systems type thinker and try and shut off my feelings and become emotionless. And as I've been practicing and cultivating joy, um, in particularly in the hard times, if there's a really difficult decision that's been made. I was actually talking to a friend earlier who was saying, like, I really cultivate a practice of optimism and kind of opening my arms up and embracing all of the things that are going on and see what options I have, that recognizing that I have more than one choice, that I don't have to be stuck in one idea. All the things are possible, and I've had some really good friends kind of help me and support me through seeing all of the possibilities that are. And one of my own faith traditions is to use both and. This idea that you'll see this in dialectical behavior therapy as well, which I've used quite a bit of. As part of that is that there's two completely opposite things that could be possible at the exact same time, and to kind of sit with the tension of that as well as the acceptance that that's possible as well. And so in acceptance and commitment therapy, I use a lot of my own values of what do I value in the world, and joy is particularly one of them. That awe and wonder and celebration of all that is. And I seek and gravitate to that. So if that's my value, I accept that, and I accept that challenges come, both and I use that as a way of moving through the world. And that's been a really healthy way of supporting my own work with my suicidality and my suicidal ideation in the past, as well as helping me through a lot of challenging times with depression and anxiety and PTSD, complex PTSD.
I'm just breathing because that's a lot of big stuff you're talking about.
Hmm.
Um, but let's just assume that there's at least one person listening who has similar big stuff that they're wading in or have waded through in the past. What is your recommendations for how people get connected? Like if someone wanted to be a part of a peer support group, how would they figure out how to pick one?
Yeah, I I think it's, start to look into your own community. And if in your community it's small and there really aren't clinic systems that provide peer support, heypeers.org is a great place to start. Depression Bipolar Support Alliance has free peer groups. That's another great place to just kind of get your foot in the water and see what's possible, even if those words don't quite resonate with you. It's a great way to see what a peer support model is like. Um, there are several clinics. Usually they're nonprofits in the area. Um, when I was working in Fort Worth, there was a clinic system there, Tarrant County, and then here I know in the San Mateo area in California, there's a great peer support model. But do some research on peer support, and ultimately, it's also peers are really just great friends if you think about it. The peer support model is intentionally not meant to be like your best friend, but if you've got some folks that you know that are good listeners and are willing to kind of support you through something, that also can be a great place to start. And it's also like a sponsor in a particular way, and in the 12-step model, it's usually a person who has 1 day more in sobriety or 1 day more in the journey than you do that can be a good sponsor. And it's in that same vein of somebody who's willing to give time and listen. Um, there are also some other models that are, professional peer support styles, but in the spiritual realm, you've got people who are spiritual directors, you've got coaches, you've got wellness and health coaches. There's all different types of folks that can help. And often when you're looking for something like that, it kind of finds you. And a good place to start, I think, maybe to just Google Hey Peers or um, Depression Bipolar Support Alliance and join a peer group and just kind of see if that model fits well for you.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I wonder, have you found a lot of great peers in the work that you do? Because you've mentioned a lot of very diverse intersections that aren't always known to go together. And specifically because you've done a bunch of your work in Texas, like, did you find peers that were like, yay, you're a deacon, yay, you're trans, yay, you're in Texas? Like, have you always found those communities, or did you have to build them?
Yeah, that's a really good point. In a lot of ways, in the long run, I've realized I've had to build many of them. I think communities will come and go for a season. I think that's a big life lesson for me is to not expect a community to always be there 100% of the time. They can't, right? Sometimes we grow from a community or they grow from us. It just depends. And so I've found opportunities to create my own communities from time to time as needed. Sometimes that's just been, kind of a pop-up community. Sometimes it's a affinity of one thing or another, whether it be a queer community. I think most recently I've noticed that in the trans ministry part of the world, there's a lot of trans folks that are particularly spiritual, that are looking for community and looking for support from each other, particularly because we're all over the place. Like we're all over the United States, even around the world. And we're so isolated we might know one other trans person or maybe two other trans clergy people. It's nice to be able to share ideas and feel supported by each other. So that's been a community that it's been really near and dear to my heart to develop. And so I've been working on developing deaconx.com. I particularly like the deacon model or mindset because it really focuses mostly on service and social justice as a deacon, that diaconal kind of way of being. It doesn't mean that pastors aren't welcome. By all means, all clergy folk of all types are welcome to this type of community. And it's really celebrating the shared wisdom of incredible folk all over the world who are wanting to know more and feel like they are valid in what the work that they're doing and the way that they are in the world, and that is quite unique. I think there are some really interesting people to follow on the internets and some groups that kind of pop up that way as well. But I'm trying to formalize something is more of a um, collegial peer support type model for ministry leaders who happen to be trans or queer. So that's what I'm doing with Deacon X.
That sounds like pretty important work. What's the best way for people to be in touch with you if they're interested in any of the things that you're talking about or want to connect?
Yeah, so I have been doing some work on social media focusing on my own transition and kind of documenting that through small stories online. And so I'm pretty much on everything that's out there. You'll find me either under the handle JJ Dollarhide or Hey JJ Godwin. That's HEY JJ Godwin. Those are the two predominant ones that I have. And I'm finding a fascinating community developing around that as well as people are commenting and cheering me on or throwing in their 2 cents on what they think about the work that I'm doing. So I would love anyone who's listening to please join in with that and join into the conversation because I think um, I really learn so much more about myself through sometimes the feedback of others. And I think that's a real kind of pure way of being, to receive information and to celebrate that as well as share it. So I would love for you to join me.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It's been lovely to have you.
Thanks so much, Megan. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you everyone who has been listening today to this conversation. Again, it might not all have been your cup of tea. It might not be the way you would do things, but perhaps it gives you a little time to think about, is groups, our peers, something that would be helpful in your wellness journey? And even if it's not, all shall be well. I hope that you will tune in, download, like, subscribe, do all those things that folk are supposed to do to say that they enjoy content, but it would mean even more if you're able to be a supporter on Patreon, and you can find the links in the info below. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope that you will take some time to cast off whatever garments are weighing you down, to take on some new vows, some new ideas, some new wellness practices that will lead you towards liberation. And I will see you next time. Take care.